Hey folks, back with you again from the paperback paradise. Now, why do I call my office the paperback paradise? Those of you who follow The Rock on Instagram will know that The Rock refers to his workout facility, his home gym, as the Iron Paradise. So this, my place with many paperback books, is the paperback paradise. So coming to you from the paperback paradise. I know it's ridiculous, but what am I going to do? Theme for today, we're going to be talking about feminisms and Black Lives Matter. This is going to be the first of a two-part lecture on the PowerPoint slides that I have sent to you. So I'm not going to get through the entirety of it. Just have that in mind. Okay, what music for today? What inspiration? I would say no better place to go than Kendrick Lamar. Go to, I'd have it playing in the background here, but there might be some copyright issues, so I'm not going to do that. I would say go to Pimp a Butterfly. If you only have time for one song, I would say King Kunta is probably a pretty good place to start for the readings for this week, or for today at least. Okay, so I'm going to wait. Okay, Kendrick has been speaking to you, I hope. Okay, so let's talk feminisms and Black Lives Matter. First substantive slide titled Obvious Now But Not Then. Just one way of contextualizing what we're talking about with feminism. We have various feminist theorists that we're reading, and Black Lives Matter is kind of critical race, obviously focused on African Americans, but is also explicitly a feminist text as well. So I'm not saying it is just feminism, but feminism actually applies both to Bell Hooks and Mary Wollstonecraft and Marilyn Frye, but it can also encompass Black Lives Matter. So I just wanted to say, just as a preface, that all of the things, or at least many of the things in the feminism readings, especially Mary Wollstonecraft and others, it might seem pretty obvious now. Basic claims about the equality of women and men, especially the ability for women to have equal representation politically and to actually have a political voice. Well, all those things seem obvious to us now, but it's only about 100 years since women across much of the world obtained the right and demanded and lobbied for, fought for, and gained the right to vote. But if you go back to the time of Mary Wollstonecraft, 1790s, this idea, which to us is so obvious, was completely absurd, so absurd that the first written response to her work is a book, and I mentioned this in the slides, is a book by Thomas Taylor called A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. Remember, her book is Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And the idea was, the response to Wollstonecraft was, it's so ridiculous to imagine that women should be voting that, well, if we're going to give women the right to vote, well, we might as well give it to all animals. So let's just give it to dogs and elephants and let them vote too. That's how crazy the idea seemed in the 1790s. And so I think it was just subjected to ridicule. And, it takes many years from Wollstonecraft writing until the first real representation for women, although I had mentioned that the state of New Jersey in the US for about 20 years after the Revolution, women did actually have the right to vote there. But that's an extremely rare exception. But just think about this, that the things that are obvious to us today were absolutely ridiculous. Really, they were still really ridiculous about 100 years ago, but 200 years ago, it was entirely ridiculous. So what's interesting about that is, and what we have to keep in mind is, it's a kind of, it's like a check on us. So we have to think to ourselves, what are the things that we imagine today to be ridiculous that in 200 years might seem completely obvious to someone? Now, I'm not saying every idea that's ridiculous today is going to seem like a good thing in 200 years, but I do think it's a serious wake-up call to try to have that long-term perspective and realize that in the course of human history, the equal representation of women to men was just an extraordinarily radical, revolutionary, unheard of idea 200 years ago. And there was good evidence to suggest, all the historical evidence would have said, well, this is just an impossible thing. Why would you even imagine that such a thing is possible or even good? And yet here we are today. So keep keep that in mind, history has a way of making fools out of us, and so it's a reminder that we always need to be checking in on the things that we think are obvious, and the things on the other side that we think are ridiculous. Okay, so if you go to the second slide. So it might seem like backing up a little bit, but it's not really to talk about Black Lives Matter, since last week we were talking more directly about African American representation, racial justice, and that sort of thing. But as I've already said, Black Lives Matter explicitly notes its connection, indeed its debt, to feminist theory in many, many sections of the selection that we read, the manifesto from Black Lives Matter. So it is a kind of feminist text. It's other things as well, but it is also a feminist text. And it's pretty clear from the manifesto that the Black Lives Matter collective, that they think that all of these sets of oppressions, or at least there's a set of oppressions that they think have to be dealt with all at once, that you can't really talk about any one of them separately, but you have to talk about feminist liberation, you have to talk about lesbian, gay, queer, trans liberation, you have to talk about capitalism and opposition to capitalism, you have to talk about and indigenous liberation, you have to talk about all of these simultaneously. This is really indebted to many traditions, but especially we could link it with the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, we didn't read this text explicitly, but where Martin Luther King Jr. says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So it really is a way of Black Lives Matter saying, look, we're not just concerned with Black lives, even though that is the focus for them, but they link it to all kinds of other liberation struggles, and they think it necessarily has to link up, that all of these things have to tie in together. And just a final note that on that slide, that this is a collective, right? So there's not one person who's authoring this text. There are a set of people who have come together, who are also borrowing from lots of different texts. I mean, they cite to some of their sources or inspirations, feminist theory, let's say, but there's not one person that we can say is the author of this text. So it's important that they wanted to present themselves as a group that didn't just have one person, one author, one, as if these ideas just come from one person. That it's their way of kind of embodying a democratic ethos, that it's a joint participatory venture of people coming together to produce this manifesto. Okay, next slide, which is entitled "The War on Black People." So that's one of the sections of the manifesto. So really, the whole text and the whole movement for Black Lives Matter begins with this idea of a war on Black folks. It's specifically focused on what's going on in the United States, but their claim is that this applies to the struggles of people of color in many, many places across the globe. So their focus is the United States, but their claim is that this is not unique to the United States, right? Especially in the way that they link struggles of people of color in the U.S. with anti-imperialist struggles globally. So it's motivated. There's the kind of spark is the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who killed, really in my view, murdered Trayvon Martin in 2012, and then he was acquitted by a jury that said, well, basically he was just acting in self-defense. And I'm not going to get into the details of the case. You please Google it and make up your own mind on that. So there was real outrage around this acquittal, and so that that summer 2013, and then following that, a number of other incidents, including the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, really sparks this revival and galvanizes this movement. For Black Lives Matter, it's a pretty simple idea that to be Black in the United States, to be African American, is to be viewed as inherently more dangerous through these cultural lenses that see Black folks as more criminal, as more violent, as more in need of control by the state, which Black Lives Matter says is a legacy of racism. A legacy of white racism against African Americans, and that it takes place at a variety of different structures. It doesn't mean all white people are racist. That is not their claim. Their focus is on some of the cultural institutions, but then on political institutions, legal institutions. So they're not making claims about individuals and whether individuals have racism in their heart. That's, that is absolutely not what they are saying. But their claim is that institutions criminalize African Americans from a pretty early age. The presence of police in schools, African American boys especially, are more likely to be subjected to kind of violent control by, let's say, police officers in schools or school disciplinary officers. Again, do some Googling for yourself. There's lots of literature, lots of scholarship on this. And then unjust treatment at the hands of law enforcement, who then see African Americans as more dangerous, and so either they're killed by police officers in interactions in which there's no reason for the police to feel threatened. So Google Philando Castile, Philando, Philando Castile. Look at his case. There are many like this. But those cases of direct police violence are almost, I don't want to say they're not important, they are important, but that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Really, Black Lives Matter points at the entire criminal justice system, that through a set of laws like the laws enacted in the United States based on the so-called war on drugs, that criminalized and really used the coercive power of the state to go after African American drug dealers. Now, the laws didn't officially say this, but they had huge penalties for possession or dealing crack cocaine. The equivalent amount of powder cocaine was not really criminalized. Powder cocaine, importantly, was more something that upper class whites used. Crack cocaine was a drug, used more by African Americans. Although obviously, lots of people, anyone can use crack, and anyone does, and anyone do. Anyway, lots of folks use crack. You might be smoking it right now. I don't know. So these institutions create this impression of African Americans as more dangerous, and then the war on drugs is kind of one of the big pieces of evidence that there is this incarceration system that then comes down on African Americans, puts them in jail for far longer sentences. So disproportionate sentencing is one of the big claims of, again, Black Lives Matter, but many other scholars. So we can even see a kind of minor example, I guess you would call it, in the kind of discussion between Trump and an African-American reporter, Yemiche Alcindor, I believe is her name, who works for NPR. And she asked him a question yesterday. You may have already seen this. And she was asking an assertive question. He interrupted her, and then she tried to continue with the question. And he said, "Don't be threatening." He repeated that. I watched it a number of times. I do not see her just trying to ask the question that she was asking as threatening, but Trump says, "Don't be threatening," and that is exactly the kind of ideology that Black Lives Matter is talking about, that he can just say this as if it's a matter of fact, that because she's just asking a question assertively, which is what reporters do, that makes her threatening. So that's just a tiny example of the kind of things that Black Lives Matter are drawing attention to. So all of this, since the 1960s, creates what Black Lives Matter calls a new Jim Crow. Jim Crow were the set of discriminatory laws and institutions that kept African Americans from having full equality across the American South between the 1880s and the 1960s. And since the 1980s, things like the war on drugs and other kinds of measures in which African Americans have been disproportionately incarcerated and then disenfranchised, because in most states in the United States, felons are not able to vote after, or have, it's a pretty hard process to get back the right to vote. So you have large numbers of African Americans who simply can no longer vote. So it's the effect of these of things like the war on drugs is to create or to recreate African Americans as an underclass in American society, at least across many areas of American society. So Black Lives Matter is calling all of this a war on Black people. I do want to say, and this is the note that I have at the bottom of this slide, that it's important to see that while their focus is on well, is on Black lives and improving Black lives, moving away from punishment and imprisonment and all of that. Most everything, not just in the imprisonment and punishment section, but throughout this document, most everything that is recommended, or I shouldn't say most, but a large number of the measures that are recommended are universal measures. In other words, getting rid of capital punishment, or getting rid of police in schools, or shifting to restorative justice or transformative principles of restorative justice or transformative justice, a whole bunch of other things in voting rights, and investment in education. A whole bunch of these things across this document are universal, so they're not just for African Americans. So much of the although much of the focus of this document is certainly on sort of healing the wounds of the legacy of slavery and the continuing war on Black people as they view it, a lot of it is just about kind of more universal social justice protections. I shouldn't even say social justice protections, more universal kind of welfare state protections for people, and enfranchisement of people from, across all races, all genders. So it really, attend to those things when you're thinking about this document. Okay, the next slide. What should be done? I just have two more slides I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matter, and then I'm going to cut this lecture, and then I will have another lecture more directly about Wollstonecraft, bell hooks, and Marilyn Frye. So what should be done? They've got 5 basic areas of focus: so reparations, investment, economic justice, community control, and power. I'm not going to say that much about each one of them. It's a bullet point list in the document, so just go through it and have a look. Attend to the fact that reparations for the damage of slavery and the legacy of slavery, because things don't just end, the problems don't end in 1865, they continue way past that. It's not just about economic reparations, but it's about creating new curriculum. It's about making sure that the curriculum in American schools actually talks about these things that were done and continue to be done, that marginalize Black folks. Investment. Again, this is where you see the kind of real universal bent of the measures. It's education, health, safety. Yes, again, there's a specific focus on the damage that has been done to Black communities, but they're interested, the Black Lives Matter collective is interested in these kind of universal social welfare measures. Economic justice, again, we see a lot of universal measures here. Progressive, a much more rigidly applied progressive taxation scheme to tax the 1% especially. Protection for jobs, return of land to indigenous communities, protection for unions and union organizing, because according to Black Lives Matter, the only way that you can effectively check capitalism is that you have to have workers who are empowered. Otherwise, they're always going to be able to be taken advantage of by the collusion of the bosses, basically. But also, they want a return to things like Glass-Steagall, which that and other measures which exerted a more firm control by the government on what Wall Street did, so that Wall Street can't collapse the economy again, as was done in 2008, or at least Wall Street certainly contributed a lot to that. I'm just getting messages all over the place. Community control, local control for police, schools, and budgets, participatory budgeting. A lot of this is just kind of basic democratic theory, but returning more power to localities, but also taking account of the fact that some of those localities have a history of racism, and so that also needs to be corrected for, adjusted for. And then political power, right? Public funding for elections. They're trying to increase voter turnout. They want more robust public funding so that it's not corporations that are able to outspend individuals or marginalized groups, enfranchising former felons, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when you actually look at the list of the things that are being asked for, a great number of them, have wide applicability. So not just limited to the African American community. Okay, so final slide here on Black Lives Matter, back to Get Out. So both Black Lives Matter and Get Out are addressing a world in which and so spoiler alert, if hopefully you've seen Get Out by now. both of these are addressing a world in which white liberals are as much the problem as overt racists. So now, obviously, the villains, the Armitages, have some pretty wicked motivations in the actual movie, but they are symbolic or emblematic of a kind of person in American society. And those people, white liberals, ostensibly view themselves as being on the side of African Americans, ostensibly view themselves as being not racist, and actually they like black culture, or they will talk about liking black culture, and they will say, no, 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 I'm on their side. I want to be an ally. But the film is pointing out, and again, it's in a kind of horror movie genre, so it's like blowing things up and making a kind of crazy world out of these tendencies. But what it's showing is the way, and here is to link to the Black Lives Matter manifesto, when it's talking about cultural exploitation, the way that white liberals will appropriate African American culture, will claim to be on side with hip hop or with Toni Morrison or Oprah or something, at the same time that nevertheless they maintain the same structures that have kept African Americans in check, and the institutions that Black Lives Matter has talked about, that maintain inequality, but also the way that there is a kind of patronization, and a kind of dwelling by the white liberals, dwelling in the victimhood, and kind of almost feeding off of the imagination of the continued suffering and disenfranchisement and second class status of African Americans, which is what the hashtag That Sunken Place refers to. That Sunken Place is the hashtag that was birthed by Get Out, that refers to the sunken place, right? That thing that happens to Chris, where he's paralyzed when Missy Armitage, the psychiatrist, mother of the family, sort of puts him in his place, and it's by getting him to talk about his pain that she's able to take advantage of him, right? She's able to sort of freeze him. And so this is a tendency among white liberals that is being symbolically discussed here. So just note that this is not a film. Get Out is not a film whose main point is to talk about overt racism. Its main point is actually to talk about the much more subtle forms of racism that occur in and through people who claim, like white liberals, claim to actually be interested in elements of black culture, but are actually kind of being parasitic on it, and are actually continuing that exploitation while claiming that they are not. So that's a really important aspect of this movie. And so basically, just to wrap up this discussion, if you get to the end of the film where Rod and Chris are at the end of the film, you might think that the kind of Black Lives Matter program may be the way to go, right? So how do you, as Rod and Chris, and again, sort of translating their experience into the kind of symbolic, what is being symbolized there, into kind of back into real world society, how do you deal with a society in which you have been rendered in a second class status, for long history, hundreds of years of marginalization by politics, economics, etc., and then this marginalization is continued in some ways by some of the very folks who claim to be on your side. So what do you do? So you might think that Black Lives Matter and the manifesto, and that program of action is the reasonable option, or is a reasonable option given those sets of circumstances. I think that is certainly one suggestion that the film has. I mean, the film doesn't give us a program; it presents us with a situation, and then the point is for us to think, well, what would be a reasonable response for Rod and Chris? What should they do? If they wanted to respond to this at a more systemic level. So I'm not going to answer, whether definitively this is the viewpoint of the film. The point of the film, in a way, we can't lock it down. It's a fictional work. It doesn't hit us over the head and say exactly what should be done after this point, or what should be done about race and justice in the U.S. or across the globe. It doesn't tell us that. The point is for us to pick up those questions and ask ourselves and try to think through that. So I will leave it with a question, because I don't think there's a way to definitively say, nor would I want to definitively say, here's what the program is that comes from this film. I think that would be to rob the film of its power. So it really does fall back with us. Okay, so that finishes me for today. I will talk to you from the paperback paradise on another day. Okay, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.